"Move a little closer," Carl said, smiling through his phone's camera. The next second, his hand slammed into my back, and I was airborne. My husband's scream was still echoing when the wind ripped it away. But what hurt worse than the fall was knowing our own daughter stayed in the car and didn't stop him. She knew. She had to, and she still let him push us. I slammed into a narrow ledge hard enough to crack a rib. Then Harold landed beside me, bruised but breathing. He gripped my wrist and whispered, "Pretend we're dead." And that's exactly what we did, because Carl just buried the wrong couple, and he has no idea what's coming. My name is Eleanor Whitaker, and I'm 75 years old. Each morning, Harold and I share coffee on our creaking porch, watching cardinals flit over the countryside we've called home since 1970. My husband, Harold, steady and sure for 53 years, still polishes our pine dinner table with lemon oil every Sunday, just as his father taught him. Our daughter Sarah married Carl Preston last spring, a businessman with perfect teeth and lingering handshakes that I first read as warmth. Now his questions about our bank accounts and property maintenance echo in Sarah's voice, making my shoulders tense. Harold keeps our financial records in a tin box under his workbench, decades of careful savings, noted in his precise handwriting. Something in Carl's watchful eyes reminds me of a fox sizing up a hen house. But let me start from the beginning. 2 months after Carl joined our family, he showed up on our doorstep with a sleek laptop and a folder full of papers. "Mom," he said. He'd started calling me that despite my gentle corrections. "Sarah and I have been worried about you and Dad. There's so many scams targeting seniors these days." I remember standing in my kitchen, the autumn sun warming the checkered curtains I'd sewn decades ago, while Carl spread his materials across our table. Harold sat quietly in his usual chair, nursing his afternoon tea. "Look at these statistics," Carl continued, sliding a colorful printout toward me. "Elder fraud is up 40%, but don't worry, I've got everything we need to protect you both." His smile was bright as ever, but something about it reminded me of those door-to-door salesmen who used to target our neighborhood. You know that feeling when someone's helping you with something you didn't ask for? That's exactly how it felt watching Carl tap away at his laptop, setting up online banking access for our accounts. "This way," he explained, "Sarah and I can monitor for any suspicious activity. Keep you safe." I glanced at Harold, but he was studying Carl with that quiet way he has, like he's reading between lines, only he can see. "Now," Carl said, "I'll need your social security numbers and birth certificates to set up some extra security measures." He made it sound so reasonable, so necessary. And when I hesitated, he played his trump card. "Sarah's just so worried about you both. You don't want her losing sleep, do you?" What could I say to that? Our daughter's concern, even if it felt manufactured, was hard to argue with. So I watched our financial privacy dissolve under Carl's efficient fingers, all in the name of protection. It started small. A week later, I was reviewing our monthly statement, Old Habits Die Hard, when I noticed a $75 withdrawal labeled Maintenance Adjustment. The next week, there was a $120 charge for insurance processing. None of these were amounts that would set off alarm bells, but they nagged at me like a loose thread on a sweater. During dinner that Thursday, I mentioned the charges to Harold. He raised one eyebrow, the way he always does when something doesn't sit right, and asked me to show him the statements after we finished eating. The next afternoon, I cornered Carl in our living room. "There seem to be some unusual withdrawals," I said, keeping my voice level. "Small ones." Carl laughed, a sound that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Oh, Mom, you must be confused. Those are just standard banking fees. You probably forgot about them because you're not used to online banking yet." He patted my hand like I was a child struggling with simple math. That night, after Carl left, I pulled out Harold's old tin ledger from under his workbench. The familiar smell of metal and paper brought back memories of countless evenings spent tracking our careful progress toward retirement. With trembling fingers, I began recording. Everything. Dates, amounts, account numbers, transaction codes. Each entry felt like adding another piece to a puzzle I didn't want to complete. When Harold found me still at it past midnight, he didn't say a word. He just pulled up a chair and started double-checking my numbers. By dawn, we had 3 pages of suspicious transactions, none over $200, but adding up to an unsettling pattern. "We need witnesses," Harold said finally, his voice grave. "And documentation. Any confrontation has to be simple, clear, and observed by others." As if on cue, my phone buzzed with a text from Carl. "Beautiful weekend ahead. How about a family drive through the mountains on Sunday? There's this gorgeous scenic turnout I've been wanting to show you." I showed the message to Harold, whose face had gone still as stone. "He's mentioned that turnout 3 times this month," Harold murmured. "Says it's perfect for family photos." My fingers hovered over the phone's keyboard while Harold and I exchanged a long look. Finally, I typed, "Sounds lovely. What time should we be ready?" Saturday evening started like any other. Harold in his reading chair, me tidying up after dinner. The familiar scent of lemon polish still clung to the dining room table I'd just finished cleaning. But that's when our quiet routine shattered. "Eleanor," Harold's voice had an edge I'd rarely heard in 53 years. "Come look at this." I set down my dishcloth and walked over. Harold had his laptop open, a gift from Sarah last Christmas that he mainly used for crossword puzzles. But instead of puzzles, I saw the county records website. Harold's finger traced across the screen to our home address, and there it was. Ownership transferred to Carl Peterson, dated 3 weeks ago. Have you ever felt the world tilt sideways? That's what happened when I saw that timestamp. The pine table I'd just polished, the window frames Harold had painted last spring, the garden where I'd grown tomatoes for decades. According to this document, none of it was ours anymore. "Print it," I whispered, and Harold did. The paper seemed to burn in my hands as I read it again and again. I grabbed my phone and called Sarah. My fingers shook so badly I had to dial twice. "Mom, everything okay?" she answered on the 3rd ring, cartoons playing in her background. "Sarah, honey, I'm looking at some property records." I tried to keep my voice steady. "It shows Carl's name on our house deed. There must be some mistake." "Oh, that!" she laughed, but it sounded forced. "Don't worry, Mom. Carl just secured it temporarily for refinancing. It's all part of the estate planning he's doing for you." Estate planning? The words tasted wrong. "Sarah, why would we need—" "Mom." Her voice went rigid, like it used to when she was a teenager brooking no argument. "Carl knows what he's doing. He's protecting everyone's interests." "But—" "I have to go, Mom. Danny's calling me." The line went dead before I could say goodbye. I looked at Harold, who'd been watching me through the whole conversation. His face was calm, but I could see the muscle working in his jaw. "We need to handle this carefully," he said, standing up to pace, his way of working through problems since forever. "No accusations, just facts, documentation, and witnesses." I sank into his vacant chair, my legs suddenly weak. "Carl's been pushing for that mountain drive tomorrow. Says he wants family photos at some scenic turnout." Harold nodded slowly. "Public space, other tourists around. Perfect place to calmly ask for explanations and demand a reversal." You'd think after discovering such a betrayal, I'd be in a panic, but something cold and clear settled over me instead. I retrieved Harold's tin ledger from his workbench and carefully paperclipped the printed deed behind our transaction records. The metal clip made a satisfying snap, like handcuffs closing. "I'll bring up the withdrawals first," I said, sliding the ledger into my canvas tote bag. "Then show him these records. He'll have to explain himself in front of Sarah and anyone else who's there." Harold touched my shoulder. "And we'll insist on new passwords for everything right there on the spot." I nodded, but my throat had gone tight. This was our daughter's husband, the father of our grandchildren. How had it come to this? Sunday morning dawned bright and cold. Carl pulled up in his shiny SUV, all smiles and weekend cheer. Sarah sat in the front passenger seat, focused on her phone. I clutched my canvas tote as Harold helped me into the back seat, the ledger inside heavy with evidence. The mountain road curved higher and tighter with each passing mile. Wind whistled against the window glass, sharp and cold like a warning. I watched Carl's hands on the steering wheel, those same hands that had patted mine so condescendingly when I'd questioned the withdrawals. The same hands that had signed our home away from us. Sarah kept her eyes forward, but I caught her reflection in the side mirror. There was something tight around her mouth, something that made me wonder how much she really knew. I clutched my canvas tote closer, the tin ledger inside pressing against my ribs like armor. The morning sun caught the metal guardrail, making it shine like a warning. Beyond it, the mountainside dropped away so sharply it made my stomach flutter just to look. "Perfect spot," Carl chirped, killing the engine. "Weather's just right for photos." Sarah stayed in the car, still absorbed in her phone, while Carl ushered Harold and me toward a weathered wooden sign describing local wildlife. The sign had a family of deer carved into it, worn smooth by years of tourist hands. "Let's get you two right here," Carl said, positioning us with the valley spread out behind us. "The light's fantastic." My heart was hammering, but I kept my voice steady. "Before pictures, Carl, we need to discuss something." I started reaching for the ledger in my tote. "Just a few quick shots first," he insisted, pulling out his phone. He took a step back, framing us with his camera. "Little closer to the sign. Perfect." The wind picked up, catching at my cardigan. Harold's hand found mine and squeezed, our signal that it was time. I opened my mouth to confront Carl about the deed. That's when I saw it, the moment his camera-ready smile simply vanished. His face went blank, like someone had wiped away a chalk drawing. His eyes turned calculating, cold as the mountain air. "Carl?" My voice sounded small against the wind. He took 2 quick steps forward. I felt his hands plant firmly against my shoulder blades, heard Harold shout my name, and then, have you ever had reality split into perfect frozen fragments? That's what happened next. The rough push that emptied my lungs, the sickening lurch as my feet left solid ground, loose gravel skittering away into empty air beneath me. The world turned upside down. Treetops wheeled under a bright slice of sun. The wind howled past my ears, or maybe that was my own voice. I couldn't tell. Car doors slammed somewhere above, the sound almost lost in the rush of air. What fills your mind in moments like that? I remember thinking about my grandmother's china plates, still wrapped in newspaper in the attic, about the half-finished crossword puzzle on my bedside table, about Sarah's first steps across our living room floor, Harold and I catching her before she could fall. Now there was no one to catch me, just wind and sky and the terrible unknown rushing up to meet me. I couldn't tell what waited below, rocks, branches, or simply nothing at all. The world had become a blur of green and blue and betrayal. Harold's voice followed me down, shouting my name. It sounded far away already, like it was coming from another life entirely. A life where sons-in-law didn't push their elderly in-laws off cliffs. A life where daughters didn't sit in cars while their parents fell through empty air. The canvas tote slipped from my fingers. Papers from the ledger scattered like startled birds, our careful documentation of Carl's theft dancing away on the wind. Such silly things to worry about now, with the ground so far below. I kept falling, unable to tell up from down anymore. The sun flashed across my eyes again, bright enough to blind. Wind tore at my clothes, my hair, my thoughts. Which was louder, the roar of air past my ears, or the thundering of my own heart? The world spun faster. Tree branches reached up like grasping fingers. Somewhere, above, a car engine roared to life. The mountain itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. And I fell, and fell, and the impact knocked every bit of air from my lungs. One moment I was falling, the next, slam. My ribs hit sandstone like a hammer strike, and pain bloomed hot across my chest. My palms burned, scraped raw against the rough ledge I'd somehow caught. For a long, dizzy moment, I just lay there, face pressed against gritty rock, trying to remember how breathing worked. The ledge couldn't have been more than 20 feet down from the rim, but it felt like I'd fallen through miles of sky to reach it. A rustle of branches below made my heart seize. Then I heard it, Harold's voice, barely a whisper. "Eleanor?" I crawled to the edge on trembling arms. Harold was sprawled in a thick patch of mountain scrub just a few feet down, leaves and twigs, caught in his silver hair. His glasses hung crooked on his nose, but his eyes were sharp and alert. "I'm here," I whispered back, my voice shaking. "Can you move?" He nodded, then began working his way up to my ledge, using roots and rock outcrops as handholds. Every sound he made, every snapping twig, every scatter of loose stone, had me holding my breath. When his hand finally gripped the ledge beside me, I nearly sobbed with relief. That's when Harold's fingers dug into my wrist, hard enough to bruise. His face was inches from mine as he hissed, "Pretend we're dead." Before I could ask why, Carl's voice drifted down from above, high-pitched with panic. "Yes, emergency services? Oh, God, there's been a terrible accident at Hawks Point Lookout." I went still as stone, barely daring to breathe. Harold's grip never loosened. My in-laws, they were posing for a photo, and the edge just gave way. Carl's voice cracked perfectly. "They fell! They fell so far! Please, you have to send help!" My stomach turned at his performance. If I hadn't felt his hands shoving me, I might have believed the terror in his voice myself. "Yes, I can give coordinates," Carl continued, rattling off numbers that meant nothing to me. "The turnout on Mountain Route 23, just past mile marker 147. Please hurry." I could almost see the emergency. Vehicles that would come screaming up the mountain road, lights flashing against the gathering dusk. Search and rescue would rappel down the cliff face, looking for bodies. Looking for us. Harold's whisper tickled my ear. "If they find us too soon." I nodded, understanding. If we were rescued now, Carl would spin his story of accident and tragedy. He'd play the grieving son-in-law, concerned enough to take control of our finances, devastated by this terrible mishap. The house would stay in his name. Our careful documentation would mean nothing. Carl's footsteps paced above us, each crunch of gravel making me flinch. Finally, the car door slammed. The engine roared to life, then faded as he drove away, probably to meet the emergency responders at the base of the mountain. Only then did Harold's grip relax. We lay there catching our breath, clouds drifting overhead like nothing had happened at all. The ledge was wider than I'd first thought, maybe 4 feet deep where it cut into the cliff face. Bushes and stunted pines grew along its length, hiding us from view above. "We need to move," Harold said after a minute, pushing himself up carefully. "Before they start searching." I followed his gaze along the cliff face. To our left, a faint line threaded through the vegetation, some kind of game trail, barely visible in the fading light. It seemed to angle away from the main lookout, switching back and forth down the slope. The taste of blood filled my mouth. I must have bit my tongue during the fall. Or maybe it was just fear I was tasting, metallic and sharp on my tongue. Either way, Harold was right. We couldn't stay here. "Ready?" he asked, offering his hand. I took it, and together we began inching along the narrow ledge. Twilight was bleeding into the ravine, turning everything gray and uncertain. Each step had to be careful, deliberate. One wrong move would give Carl the ending he wanted after all. The mountain waited below us, full of shadows and silence, as we picked our way into the gathering dark. The sun crept over the ridge, turning the mountain gray and ghostly. My whole body ached. bruises from the fall, scratches from branches we'd groped past in the dark. Every step on the rough trail sent jolts through my tender feet. You know that feeling when you've been awake so long, everything starts seeming unreal? The pines around us looked like cutouts against the pale sky. Even the birds sounded wrong, their morning songs too sharp and bright for what we'd been through. 3 more bends, Harold wheezed beside me. His silver hair was matted with pine needles, and dried blood made a rust-colored streak down his temple. But his eyes stayed fixed ahead, tracking the path he remembered from his volunteer days at the ranger station. I tried to match his steady pace, though my dress shoes, sensible as they were, weren't made for mountain hiking. The backs had rubbed my heels raw hours ago. Pine pitch stained my cardigan sleeves where I'd grabbed at branches to keep my balance. "Harold," I said, when his breathing got too ragged. "Let's rest a moment." He shook his head. "Frank will be there. He always checks the station at dawn." The faith in his voice steadied me. Harold and Frank went back decades, fishing buddies who'd kept in touch even after Frank retired from his law practice to these mountains. If anyone would help us without questions, it would be Frank. We rounded another bend, and there it was, a weathered cabin with green painted trim, tucked against the mountainside like it had grown there. Smoke wisped from the chimney. Harold's knock was barely a tap, but the door opened immediately. Frank stood there, coffee mug in hand, shock flickering across his weathered face. Without a word, he pulled us inside. The cabin's warmth hit me like a wall. My legs started shaking so bad I had to grab the back of a chair. Frank pressed his mug into my hands and dragged over another chair. "Sit," he ordered, already moving to the wood stove where a pot of coffee bubbled. "Before you fall down." I sipped the coffee, strong and bitter, exactly what I needed, while Harold gave Frank the bare bones. Carl, the cliff, our hidden survival. My fingers trembled against the warm ceramic as I pulled the tin ledger from my tote bag. "I kept track," I said, spreading papers across Frank's kitchen table. "Every withdrawal he made without permission, and this—" I tapped the deed printout with its damning timestamp. "Shows he transferred our house to his name just last week." Frank listened, his face getting grimmer by the minute. When I finished, he walked to his desk and came back with a manila folder. "Carl's been busy," he said quietly. "These came across my desk yesterday morning." The papers he laid out were legal documents, dense with official stamps and careful language. But certain phrases jumped out like they were printed in red. Emergency motion. Elder. Incapacity. Temporary control pending investigation. Tragic accident. "He filed these papers claiming you're both presumed dead," Frank explained. "He's moving for emergency control of your accounts and estate. Says it's to preserve assets while authorities investigate the accident." My coffee turned to acid in my stomach. "How quickly can he get control?" "Emergency motions can be granted within days, sometimes hours." Frank's jaw tightened, especially when the previous owners are unavailable to object. The devastation I'd been holding back crashed over me. I'd thought documenting the theft would be enough, that we just needed witnesses to confront Carl. But he'd planned deeper than that. He'd pushed us off a cliff and was using our deaths to take everything we'd spent our lives building. My hands clenched around the coffee mug, knuckles white with fury and fear. All those years of careful saving, the home where we'd raised our daughter, the security we'd planned to pass on, Carl would own it all before our bodies could even be found. Frank must have seen something in my face, because he reached across the table and gripped my shoulder. "You'll stay here," he said firmly. "We'll get you food, clean clothes, and then we'll make a plan." I nodded, not trusting my voice. My eyes drifted to the wall calendar, hanging by Frank's desk. Friday Square was circled in bright red ink, some deadline or appointment that now seemed trivial compared to our crisis. But that red circle caught at something in my mind. Time was running out, yes, but we weren't powerless. We had proof, we had Frank's legal knowledge, and most importantly, we had the element of surprise. Carl thought we were dead. That was his mistake, and we were going to make him regret it. Frank laid down 3 ground rules before we'd even finished our coffee. First, Harold and I would use the back room. It had no windows facing the main road. Second, we'd rest in shifts while he worked the phones. And third, absolute silence when vehicles passed. "I've got trusted clerks at the courthouse," he said, pulling folders from a filing cabinet. "People who'll keep quiet, but we need to move carefully." I nodded, already spreading our documents. Across his kitchen table. The familiar routine of organizing papers helped steady my hands. Remember those old days in the accounting office? How a messy desk would clear itself once you started sorting things into proper piles. Same principle here, just with higher stakes. "Eleanor." Frank handed me a fresh binder and some dividers. "Start with the bank statements. Work backwards from last month. Note every withdrawal that looks suspicious." I pulled out my reading glasses and got to work. Harold insisted on helping despite his bruised hip, cross-referencing everything against his tin ledger. The familiar scratch of his pencil beside me brought back decades of evening bookkeeping at our kitchen table. "Date every entry," Frank coached from his desk phone. "Courts love chronological order." Hour by hour, panic gave way to proof. Carl's paper trail emerged like a map of greed. Small withdrawals that grew bolder, account transfers without our signatures, the deed transfer buried in routine paperwork. I wrote it all down in clear, factual language. No emotion, just evidence. Frank worked his own angles between calls. "We've got options," he said during a coffee break. "But timing is critical. If we surface too soon, Carl could spin it as confusion or dementia. We need backup evidence, witnesses, maybe even surveillance. When we show ourselves, the proof has to be overwhelming." My hands trembled as I reached for my coffee cup. The mountain air had chilled my bones, and exhaustion pressed against my temples like an iron band. "Frank," I whispered, "I don't know if I can do this. We're not young anymore. Maybe we should just..." "Just what?" Frank's eyes locked onto mine. "Let him steal everything you've built, everything you meant to leave your grandchildren?" Harold's hand found mine under the table. His grip was warm and sure, like always. Frank leaned forward. "Eleanor, let me ask you something. When you balanced books all those years, did you ever let a single penny go unaccounted for?" "Never," I said automatically. "And when Harold tracked every expense in that tin ledger, was it just about money?" I squeezed Harold's hand. "No. It was about building something lasting, something secure for our families. Future. Then answer me this. Does love yield to theft?" The question hit me like a splash of cold water. I straightened my spine, feeling steel replace exhaustion. "No," I said firmly. "It does not." Frank nodded, satisfied. "Good, because I may already have something useful." He stood and walked to his filing cabinet. When Carl first started showing up at community meetings, something felt off. I took some precautions, but I need to verify a few things first. The next morning, Frank left at dawn to retrieve something from his office downtown. "Keep the doors locked," he said, jingling his keys. "I'll be back by afternoon." Harold and I settled into what we did best, organizing. You know how some people pace when they're nervous? We alphabetize. My fingers still remembered the quick sort method from my bookkeeping days, making quick work of receipts and statements. "Remember that spring when we cataloged every receipt for the IRS audit?" I asked Harold as we worked. He chuckled, and for a moment, the fear eased. Amazing how familiar tasks can anchor you, even when your world's been pushed off a cliff. I practiced my sworn statement while Harold labeled exhibit folders. The words had to be exact, dates, times, every phrase Carl had used. On October 12th, at approximately 2:15 p.m., Carl Whitaker accessed our joint accounts. Without authorization, My voice grew stronger with each revision. Protection from scams, Harold muttered, checking his ledger. That's what he called it when he changed our passwords. I nodded, adding that detail to my statement. And remember how he laughed when I questioned those maintenance fees? Called me forgetful, right to my face. The morning light crept across Frank's kitchen table as we worked. Every now and then, a car would pass on the road outside, and we'd freeze like spooked deer until the engine noise faded. Even the coffee pot seemed too loud as it burbled in the corner. Frank returned around 2, carrying a locked drive and a stack of legal papers. Had to document the chain of custody, he explained, setting everything down carefully. Can't leave any holes for Carl's lawyers to poke through. He told us how it started. Carl showing up at community business meetings months ago, asking pointed questions about elder care facilities and estate planning. Something felt off, Frank said, pulling up files on his laptop. The way he'd circle conversations back to financial controls. So I took precautions. What kind of precautions? I asked. I manage the building where Carl's office suite is. There's clear signage about security monitoring in all common areas, standard liability coverage. When I noticed Carl holding improper client meetings in the shared conference room instead of his private office, I made sure that room's camera system was working properly. Harold leaned forward. And you kept the footage? Secured and authenticated, with timestamps. Frank's fingers moved across the keyboard. We'll need to establish relevance to your case, but given the timing of these clips, I watched Frank work through authentication steps I barely understood. Verification codes, digital signatures, something called metadata. Harold spread his ledger entries across the desk, highlighting withdrawal patterns. Look here, Harold said, pointing to a series of transactions. These dates match when Carl was using the conference room. My chest tightened with a strange mix of hope and dread. We were building something solid, but would it be enough? And would it be ready in time? As if answering. My thought, a courier's motorcycle rumbled outside. Frank retrieved a thick envelope and laid it on the desk. The court seal might as well have been stamped in lead. Friday's emergency hearing notice felt that heavy. 3 days. We had 3 days to stop Carl from legally erasing us. Frank pulled his chair closer to the laptop screen, adjusting settings. Let's see exactly what we've got here. He clicked on a file labeled Perfect Accident. The video quality wasn't perfect, but Carl's voice came through crystal clear. My stomach lurched as I watched him lean back in the conference room chair, tie loosened, talking to someone just off camera. It's all lined up, he was saying, that familiar shark smile spreading across his face. The perfect accident. 2 old folks, a scenic overlook. Who's going to question it? He laughed, and I felt Harold's hand tighten around mine. Best part? Their daughter's so wrapped up in her own life, she'll barely notice. By the time the dust settles, I'll have control of everything. The other voice, deeper, asked something about timing. Already filed the emergency motion, Carl replied, tapping his phone. Judge Morrison's known for fast-tracking these elder cases. Once the tragic accident happens, boom, I step in to protect the estate. Clean, simple, done. Frank paused the playback, freezing Carl's face mid-smirk. The timestamp showed this was just 3 days before our cliff encounter. My tea had gone cold, untouched, beside the laptop. This changes everything, Frank said, already pulling up legal documents. We'll file this under seal. Means it stays private until the hearing. No chance for Carl to spin it beforehand. I watched Frank's fingers fly across the keyboard, crafting what he called a supplemental motion. You ever watch someone do something they're brilliant at? It's like seeing a master carpenter work wood or a pianist lost in a familiar piece. Frank's legal expertise flowed like that, natural, precise, purposeful. Here's how Friday plays out, he explained, looking up from his typing. I present the sealed evidence first thing. Judge Morrison views it in chambers. That's her private office. Only after she's seen everything do you two make your entrance. Harold nodded slowly. The shock value. Exactly, Frank agreed. Carl won't have time to construct lies. He'll be too busy watching his whole scheme implode. My hands were shaking, but not from fear anymore. Strange how terror can harden into something else when you finally see your path forward. What do you need from us? Clean copies of everything, Frank said, pulling out a checklist. Bank statements, deed transfer, heralds. Ledger entries. We'll make certified copies of your IDs, show you're both sharp as tacks, no incapacity in sight. The next hours blurred into a rhythm of sorting, copying, and organizing. I labeled exhibits while Harold double-checked dates against his tin box records. Frank made calls to courthouse security, arranging our discreet entrance through a side door. Remember, Harold whispered as we worked, his steady presence beside me like, always, calm is our revenge. Let him be the one who loses control. The wisdom in that steadied me. I thought of Carl's smooth manipulations, his practiced concern, his calculated push that was supposed to end us. But here we were, alive and armed with truth, preparing to push back. Dawn crept in while we finished the last preparations. Frank helped us with fresh clothes and basic toiletries. We had to look presentable, not like we'd spent days hiding. My silver hair went back in its usual neat bun. Harold straightened his tie. The courthouse loomed ahead as Frank drove us through early morning traffic. My heart hammered against my ribs, but my hands stayed steady, clutching our evidence binder. The building's stone steps seemed to stretch upward forever. Inside, the hallway clock struck 8. The marble floors echoed with morning footsteps. Frank touched my elbow, guiding us to a small conference room to wait. Through the door, I heard a bailiff's voice ring out, "Calling emergency hearing in R.E. Whitaker Estate, Judge Morrison presiding." I'd watched enough courtroom dramas over the years to expect gavels banging and lawyers shouting. But real justice, I learned that morning, moves with quiet intensity. The only sounds were soft footfalls on carpet and the whisper of papers being sorted as Judge Morrison's clerk arranged exhibits. Frank had positioned us in a small witness room, door cracked just enough to hear. You know that feeling when you're backstage before a school play? That's what it felt like, my heart doing double time while I waited for my cue. Harold's familiar cologne, the same sandalwood he'd worn for decades, helped steady my nerves. Through the gap, I watched Carl stride in like he owned the place, briefcase swinging. He wore his best charcoal suit, and that practiced, concerned expression I'd come to hate. His lawyer, a sharp-faced woman in navy, settled beside him with color-coded folders. "Your Honor," Frank began, "before we address the emergency motion, I have evidence under seal that demands immediate attention." The judge, a silver-haired woman about my age, nodded. "Proceed, counselor." The laptop screen flickered to life on her bench. Even from our hidden spot, I could see Carl's face pale as his own voice filled the quiet room. "The perfect accident. Who's gonna question it?" Whispers rippled through the gallery. The timestamp appeared in the corner, network verification logs scrolling beneath. Carl's lawyer started scribbling furiously. Judge Morrison's eyebrows climbed higher with each damning second. When Carl laughed about his own daughter barely noticing, I saw the judge's mouth tighten into a hard line. The recording ended. You could have heard a pin drop. "Mr. Whitaker," Judge Morrison said, fixing Carl with a stare that could have frozen July. "Would you care to explain this?" Carl shot to his feet. "Your Honor, this has to be some kind of trick. Deepfakes, computer manipulation." "The metadata and network logs are authenticated," Frank interrupted smoothly. "This footage comes from legally posted security cameras in a common area. Notice. Has been properly filed." "I've seen enough," Judge Morrison cut in. "All accounts and assets connected to the Whitaker estate are frozen, effective immediately. We'll schedule a full evidentiary hearing next week." She paused, adjusting her glasses. "Though I understand there may be interested parties who wish to be heard today." That was our cue. Frank nodded toward the bailiff, who opened our door wide. Harold squeezed my hand as we stepped into the courtroom. The gallery erupted in gasps and murmurs. I kept my eyes locked on Carl, watching his face crack like thin ice on a winter pond. His perfect mask shattered as he realized the people he'd tried to erase were standing there, very much alive. "Oh my God," someone whispered. Carl's lawyer dropped her pen. "Your Honor," Frank said calmly, "I present Eleanor and Harold Whitaker, very much alive and of sound mind, to contest these proceedings." Carl's mouth worked soundlessly. He looked like a fish suddenly finding itself on dry land, gaping and desperate. "The court orders immediate protective measures," Judge Morrison announced, her voice cutting through the chaos. "The House title transfer is suspended pending full review. Mr. Whitaker is to have no contact with the petitioners." She fixed Carl with another Arctic stare. "And I'm forwarding this evidence to the district attorney's office for criminal investigation." I felt 50 pounds lighter walking out those courthouse doors. Reporters clustered on the steps, microphones thrust forward like spears. A woman in a neat blazer, producer's badge clipped to her lapel, touched my elbow. "Mrs. Whitaker," she whispered urgently, "we're breaking this story in 20 minutes. Would you like to make a statement?" I'd never been much for television, but that evening, our small screen felt like a window into another world. There was Carl's face, not the charming son-in-law mask he'd worn for years, but a mugshot-style photo that made him look exactly what he was, a predator caught in his own trap. Man accused of pushing elderly in-laws. "Off cliff for inheritance" blazed across the bottom of the screen. The words kept appearing between commercials for car dealerships and arthritis medication like a persistent reminder that nightmares sometimes walk in broad daylight. You ever watch one of those nature shows where they catch a fox in the henhouse? That's what Carl's expression reminded me of. All teeth and terror once the light hits. The reporters didn't miss a detail, from the court transcripts to the miraculous survival angle. They even dug up his previous business dealings, which apparently weren't as clean as he'd claimed. My phone hadn't stopped, buzzing since we left the courthouse. Martha from my bridge club, Reverend Stevens, even old Mr. Peterson who runs the hardware store. Everyone had questions, concerns, offers of help. I answered what I could, but mostly I just let Frank handle the official responses. He had a way of making everything sound factual and measured, like reading ingredients off a soup can. Then Sarah called, my daughter. My heart still catches when I think about that. Call. "Mom?" Her voice cracked like thin ice. "Tell me it isn't true. Tell me Carl didn't—" The sobs that followed hit me like physical blows. I remembered her first heartbreak at 16, how I'd held her while she cried over some boy whose name I can't even recall now. But this time, I couldn't just wrap her in my arms and make it better. "Sarah, honey," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "We need to meet with Frank present. There's so much to explain, but it has to be done properly." She didn't understand at first, kept insisting we could just talk it out over coffee like we used to. But some bridges, once burned, need architects and engineers to rebuild, not just good intentions and fresh paint. Harold found me later in the kitchen, staring at our old teapot, the one Sarah had given us for our 50th anniversary. The copper bottom was starting to wear through, just like my patience with pretending things could ever be simple again. "You did right," he said, squeezing my shoulder. "We protect her by doing this properly." The judge's clerk's email arrived just before dinner, a crisp, professional message about title irregularities requiring immediate attention. All those fancy words really meant one thing. Carl had made mistakes in his paperwork, left fingerprints all over his scheme. The house would come back to us, but we needed to appear at the county office the next morning to sign documents. "More signatures," Harold muttered, adjusting his reading glasses to review the attached forms. "Seems like signatures got us into this mess in the first place." He wasn't wrong. Every time I thought about all those papers Carl had us sign, Just routine updates, he'd said. My stomach turned sour. But these new signatures would be different. These would be our shield, our fortress walls rebuilt. I lay in bed that night, listening to Harold's steady breathing beside me. The ceiling held no answers, but I stared at it anyway. Tomorrow would bring another stack of papers, another round of initials and dates and legal language. Each signature would either lock our safety into place, or the alternative sat in my mind like a stone in a garden, heavy and unmovable. I thought of Sarah, of Carl's face on the ha. News of all the nights we'd spent at family dinners while he planned our accident. The truth had hardened something in me, like pottery in a kiln. I was no longer just Eleanor Whitaker, retired bookkeeper and grandmother. I was a survivor, and tomorrow I'd make sure every signature proved it. You know those moments when your signature looks like it belongs to someone else? That wasn't what happened at the county records office. Each stroke of my pen felt deliberate, like I was carving our names back into stone. The clerk, a thin woman with reading glasses on a chain, kept nodding as she verified each document. Mrs. Whitaker, if you'll initial here and here. She pointed with a manicured finger that reminded me of my banking days. Mr. Whitaker, your signature on this line. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead while Frank reviewed every page before we signed. Have you ever watched someone dismantle a trap? That's what it felt like, each document reversing Carl's handiwork, piece by piece. My hand didn't shake like I'd feared it might. Instead, it moved with the kind of certainty you find after weathering a storm. These transfers were clearly executed under fraudulent pretenses, the clerk explained, stamping each corrective instrument with a solid thunk. The court order makes the restoration straightforward. Harold sat beside me, his reading glasses perched on his nose as he double-checked every detail. 53 years of marriage, and he still surprised me with his thoroughness. We'll need certified copies, he said, voice firm. 3 sets, please. Frank gathered the copies before noon, tucking them into his briefcase like precious cargo. I'll file these immediately, he assured us. By sunset, there won't be a single question about who owns that house. The drive home felt different, lighter somehow. You'd think after everything that happened, I'd see threats in every shadow. But when we pulled into our driveway, past the creaking porch boards and up to our front door, all I felt was right. Inside, sunlight streamed through the windows we'd left curtained for too long. I walked through each room, trailing my fingers along familiar surfaces. The pine table in the dining room still smelled faintly of lemon polish. Dust motes danced in the light as I pulled open curtains, letting brightness flood every corner. Each window I uncovered felt like taking back another piece of ourselves. Harold, I said, pausing by the kitchen window that overlooked our garden. I need to do something. He looked up from where he was sorting mail at the counter. What's on your mind, Eleanor? The cliff. The words came out steady, surprising. Us both. Not for closure. I don't believe in that kind of neat ending. But I want to plant something there, something alive. Most husbands might have argued, might have called it morbid or unnecessary, but Harold just nodded, understanding as always. Give me a minute to check the shed, he said. He returned with a small spade and one of the heritage rose bushes we'd been saving for spring planting. Its roots were carefully wrapped in burlap, the thorny stems promising both beauty and protection. Exactly right for what we had in mind. The drive to the cliff took 20 minutes. Each mile marker brought back memories of that Sunday, but they felt distant now, like watching scenes from someone else's life. Harold parked in the same turnout where it had happened. The gravel crunched under our shoes as we walked toward that weathered sign, the last thing I'd seen before Carl's hands hit my back. The sun was sliding toward the ridge, painting everything in shades of amber and rose. A fitting light for what we'd come to do. The valley below looked different in this light. Peaceful, even. You'd never guess what had happened here if you didn't know. But that's true of most battlegrounds, isn't it? They go quiet after the war is won. Harold knelt beside me, his knees creaking against the gravel. We'd chosen our spot carefully, just back, from the edge, where the soil looked rich enough to nurture roots. My fingers traced the loose earth, remembering how it had crumbled beneath my grip during the fall. But this time, I was the one choosing where and how to break the ground. "Did you see the morning paper?" Harold asked, unwrapping the burlap from our rosebush. "They've frozen everything Carl touched." I nodded, working the spade into the dirt. "Frank called earlier. Said the judge's orders were comprehensive. Assets, accounts, even his business dealings. The soil turned easily under the blade, dark and promising. Apparently, pushing your in-laws off a cliff makes people question your other financial decisions." "Channel 4 ran another segment last night," Harold added, helping me widen the hole. "His face is everywhere now. Even that fancy country club dropped his membership." I thought about Carl's perfect teeth, his designer suits, the way he'd cultivated his image like a prized garden. Now, his name populated search results for all the wrong reasons. Sometimes justice works like water, steady, patient, impossible to hold back once it finds its path. The rosebush settled into its new home with a kind of rightness that made my throat tight. We packed soil around its base, our hands working together like they had for over 5 decades. The thorny stems stood, proud against the sky, ready to guard this place that had nearly become our ending. "Pass me the watering can?" I asked Harold. The water darkened the soil as it soaked in, securing new life where death had been intended. Some might call it poetic, but I prefer to think of it as practical. The best revenge is living well, after all. Our daughter hadn't called in weeks. That silence was its own kind of wound, but a necessary one. We'd given her space. Let the facts speak for themselves. The court transcripts, the video evidence, the financial records, they told a story no mother wants to believe about her husband. Sometimes love means stepping back, letting truth do its work without forcing confrontations. Harold helped me to my feet, brushing dirt from my knees with gentle hands. "Ready?" he asked. "Almost." I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a certified copy of our restored house deed. I tucked it under a rock near the rosebush, letting the morning breeze ruffle its edge. Not as a reminder of what we'd lost, but of what we'd reclaimed. The sun crested the ridge then, catching on thorns and new leaves. Light spilled across the valley, transforming everything it touched, including us, including this place. "You know what I've learned from all this?" I said, taking Harold's hand as we stood there. He squeezed my fingers. "What's that?" "Greed digs graves." I gestured at the cliff edge that had nearly been ours, then turned to the rosebush standing sentinel in the morning light. "But love plants roots."